Here is the lecture on construction logistics, and I'm going to touch on several parts, in part to do with why construction logistics is so important, and then through three examples of what or how construction logistics are implemented at different parts of a project, and how one implements and communicates those. One of the projects you're familiar with is Mentmore Terrace behind the LSA. We've gone through that before. Another project is the Colville Estate in Hackney, designed by Carrick Carson and David Chipfield, which I believe you've been around. And then a third example, which we'll probably touch on first, is by Soda and Matt Architecture on Charing Cross Road. It's the former Foyle's bookshop. The usefulness of that site is simply its scale in Soho and the busyness of Charing Cross Road, so those complexities. Now, why are we talking about logistics? Why is it something that's important? Why construction, traffic, and things like that relevant at all? Well, early on in the course, we've talked about intuition and that ability as an alchemist within the city, an entrepreneur, somebody that can see opportunities and from those opportunities devise simultaneously uses and functions and languages that will sit into that architecture. So to build, one needs a site. One doesn't necessarily always need uses. There's plenty of thesis that one can build shelter in the city, and if it's well built and if it's of the right architectural language, then uses will come to it. Build it and they will come. It's very much the sort of thesis of some of the London metropolitan units, the Arrow units, that deals with some of those principles that objects and the tessellation of masses and buildings within the city will set up a dynamism and dialogue between those that in that activation will engender use, and it's Smithson's example of the charge for it. So starting with an example of Carrick Carson, just quickly sort of panning through, you can see some of those. I just showed you the Mentmore Terrace one. Here are ultimately the Google Drive folders that from which you can find those pieces of information, and you know, the Colville Estate one is a great amount of information in comparison to normal projects, and that's obviously sourced from the Hackney Planning Portal. When you go to the Westminster Planning Portal, very much the same as any local authority. You put in the search code, find the criteria, up comes the planning application, there's the planning application number, and then you go through to documents and you get the long list of what it is that's being set out to achieve here. Now, this is the Westminster scheme. It's the Charing Cross Road, it's the Foyles. It has 200 and odd documents in the application. So this was submitted way later in RIBA stages than the other two examples. So there's much more information known at this point. You can see here the document I've just opened, site boundary demolition plan. This is a drawing within the construction method statement. So the logistics plan of the project is being submitted at the same time as the main application. Whereas when we look at the other two projects, here we have design and access statement and the demolition drawings. These are being produced for that application, whereas on Mentmore and Colville, they're both being produced much later in stages 3 and 4 to discharge those conditions. So it's a strategy point of view. It's how much you want to confess at a certain point of time, how much of the planning process you go into. But your DPD is a stage 2 document. So it's assuming that this is, your design principles. They're being confessed and shared within the project team. They're forming part of that design and access statement. But ultimately, they're setting out what the principles are of the design that are important to you, that are incumbent to some of the complexities and constraints that a project would have to consider when being resolved. And demolition is one of the first parts of that, as you can see being exampled in this drawing. How simply can you communicate some of these constraints in order for other team members to understand your design principles. In your eyes as the architect, through the lens with which you're looking at this site and this opportunity, what have you seen as the constraints or the principal opportunities that a site could give you? So here you can see that site boundary and demolition plan. It's a huge amount of Soho. It's not swathes and swathes of streets, but it's a very, very large urban block. It's going to be a massive urban building. It connects three streets together. One of them a principal red route between Charing Cross and Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street on Charing Cross Road itself. And then through past the back alley into the back streets of Soho, providing new public space, new courtyards. So one has to have a grip of seeing those many buildings and constituent parts coming together, but coming together through a process of unpicking them. Which buildings simply must you retain from the points of view of many different parts of policy, and how would you maintain those? How do the site logistics allow you to be on site whilst retaining those historic facades and all the temporary works that are needed to hold up those historic facades whilst you're doing other big disturbing work around them? How can you retain a historic facade on a busy road whilst digging a 4-story basement directly adjacent to it? And how can you do that with those temporary works being in the way of your construction? You as the architect need to be able to look at that site and say, I don't think I can build what I'm wanting to build there unless I build it in this certain way, or unless I ask our neighbour to allow me to use their site, the adjacent piece of land, to set up my facilities on. Or I might need to ask the local authority to close the road. These are questions that might get downplayed in terms of their importance, but they're intrinsically important in terms of you being able to justify the use, scale, mass and form of the building which you're putting together. So back to Mentmore Terrace, open up a series of documents here, a comparative construction method statement, very small, 6 pages and very, very generic. But what we'll build up here is a case where that generic document is appropriate for the relative scale of the application and the job stage with which it was submitted. It was submitted at stage 2. But then the subsequent information that came following that subsequent information is set out by the local authorities' planning officers in their granting of the application under conditions to complete pre-commencement. And you'll pick that up in the language of the email that you received. So what are those pre-commencement conditions and how are they discharged? Well, they're discharged by the later stage in the project providing more information. And one of those pieces of information is this construction method statement. So one knows that from the work that's been submitted for planning that there is still this background of other knowledge that is being built up and not necessarily confessed at that point, but that the application is predicated on. And in many cases, it's predicated on, right at the start of the project, somebody being able to say, right to light's going to be okay, daylight, sunlight and overshading is going to be okay. It looks like I can get vehicles in and out of this site. It looks like I can oversail that building, but maybe not this road. And starting to say, okay, I think I can get a building and I can build right up to the site edge. And I think I can get 8 or 9 stories high, maybe 4 stories deep. And that's going to quickly, when I start to divide floor plates across that, give me this much site area. Well, that much site area in this part of town means that I can place this much project budget against it, this much construction cost, and therefore this much return. Whereas one might have to look at it and say, there are too many complexities here, which mean I can only build in this certain fashion. So that document starts to set out to the planners the viability. But that viability in generic text is then built up on more detailed information. This is a drawing that starts to justify and discharge the conditions on townscape and facade. So on the right-hand side, you can see the renders of a relatively complex building in terms of having a masonry plinth, a separated amenity level, and then some cantilevered residential floor space. The section on the left explains that complexity. It is not an easy building to put together. Maybe it is too hard. Maybe a simpler building could have been put on the site, no doubt. But the value of that architecture has been judged by the client, the developer, the architect as the right route to take, and has been judged by the local authority that it's viable to build. That complexity of building is achievable. So this drawing sits alongside, this is the construction logistics drawing, sits alongside all the other information and justifies how that building of complex multi-use and oversailing residential above commercial office can take place. It can be built in that fashion because there's an understanding of the craneage, of the scaffolding, of the licenses for adopting pavements, and of the different sequences. I'll start with the craneage. The craneage is built out of the central core, it's in yellow, and that elliptical boom swing is allowing for the crane to, in part, separate itself from the risks of oversailing adjacent sites. So it's a luffing jib. That means it goes up and down. It doesn't just sit out flat horizontal. Complexities like that, which are committing the developer and the contractor to using a certain piece of site plant and is entwined into the planning application, means that they have to do it in that way. And this is quite an early commitment. This in the case of the Soho Foils project, was committed at planning as part of the submission. This document was submitted as a discharge much later, possibly even just before site was commenced, after stage 4. But still, it's setting out the premise for how one does something and doesn't affect the amenity of the adjacent neighbour's site and parts of the city. So that's really important. Viability. Is what you're proposing viable? Can you understand those logistics that determine the viability relative to not only what you're wanting to achieve from the site and the end use, and that might be from a commercial position, but also the viability of what the city can host? A big question that's being asked in the City of London at the moment is, how can we phase construction? Not should we build, the values of land are such that the technical solutions and the engineering capacity will be achieved. But should we be phasing construction simply because the road network can't take the number of vehicles moving up and down it with either the supply of materials and major steelwork, or the removal of debris through demolition or the excavation of basements? So there's a viability question that the City of London have to ask themselves in terms of how much can be brought to sites at a certain time, or certain sites might demonstrate that they can be brought because they've got effective logistics. A site might be saying 60% of my building is off-site, and therefore I don't have the same incumbent demands on the city that the other building up the road has, which has 80% built on the site. So how can you be effective with the alchemy with which you're presenting? How can you say logistics shouldn't be something that is a topic that we discuss? It should just be intuitively understood by all the critics and able to withstand the probity that is necessary. So why is value and viability important in this? Well, we're moving to the Colville example here. What I'm bringing up is the Colville Phase 3 detailed pictorial specification. Now, what's interesting about this is, again, whilst it was a discharge condition later in the process, this was discharging a great deal of information. A great deal of information that Hackney wanted to make sure was written into the permission, that there was no opportunity for the developer, once all things were said and done and signed, was starting to become reneged upon and the quality of the project reduced. This was an assurance policy for Hackney to make sure that all of those qualities that had been promised in early negotiations and were promised in order to develop this project, its density, its height, its number of private dwellings that could be realised and therefore generate the income through sales. Well, they wanted to make sure that it was going to be that highest quality of architecture. So what this document does is start to set out and build the case for that. It starts to go through each of these component parts, material parts, and explain why they're important. Now you'll see as I scroll down, there's everything from window casements, facade details, relative materials. There's a section on what it is, how it's to be used and where it is, and the picture of it, and masonry facades, etc., etc. So why spend cost inefficiently on an expensive set of logistics because you're building something in a complicated manner and therefore not provide yourself with a budget to spend money where it should be spent on quality parts of the material project, when one could save money by being effective with one's logistics. Here is an example of the bespoke goods lift. Simple little hard skill of a sketch to explain what it is. Important, it's bespoke. Now, one can't start doing bespoke goods lifts unless one has a budget that's going to enable that. One won't have a budget to enable parts of that unless one's logistics are effective and efficient. If one's building in a manner with which one does, and due to ill-guided or ill-considered approach to the site, and therefore the logistics, one won't have those budgets. And that's this really important part of value and viability. And it comes all the way back down to, is it viable to build the building you've drawn and you've presented in terms of its appearance, its language, and its use, and be able to achieve what the use demands of its quality if one hasn't considered logistics. Here's the plan, ground floor plan of the Colville. It's a complicated building, it's a peculiar building, but there are ways in which that's made sure that it's efficient. And that's, in this case, through an understanding of the site, logistics, and the phasing. I'm bringing up the structural concept diagrams. It's a document by Structural Engineers Momentum. It takes you through all the different principles of the structural loads, the capacity, the structural diagram of how the shear walls work and the core works as a stability principle, and the precast and the cast in situ tension of concrete. But importantly, when you come down to this section here, this is construction phasing. What's critical here is an understanding of how efficiency can be laboured through logistics, and that podium built and the basement excavated and the two towers built on top. Now, were there to be any wastage in this process, were there to be any inefficiencies or complications, but also uncosted risks? So this comes back to another part of your DPD submission, the risk register. Every project has risks, and a lot of those risks in the later stages, as one knows more about it, are to do with how one builds. You can design out a lot of risks, you can control a lot of other risks in relative terms due to knowing more or spending more time around something in order to know more. But there are a lot of risks that relate to parts you are in far less control of. So those risks that come out of site processes, those risks that appear because simply one doesn't know what an existing building might hold for one or what is in the ground. But one can reduce the risk of not knowing what's in the ground by doing intrusive surveys into the ground, trial pits, investigative work, boreholes. So what are you putting in place in order to understand logistics better? How are you making sure that you can construct in the most efficient way possible? That you're not trying to use a construction method, cast in situ concrete, for example, a really high labour, high cost, high complexity construction method, if one doesn't have the site and the logistics available to achieve it. So those are important. If you're trying to build a building that has an architectural language and an aesthetic of a certain type, make sure there's the capacity on site to do so. Now I'm going to open up the landscape specification document, and this document sets out the terms for the specification, all sorts of things. And I'm going to try and find just quite quickly, it's quite hard, section R2, it's much further down in the document, and this is below ground drainage. So why am I showing you this, and what's that got to do with logistics? Well, the connection of permanent services to the site relative to the existing permanent services, critical. If you can't bring all the parts of your building down to ground and through into the city that are required, your building won't work, and vice versa, the adjacent buildings might stop working. If there is not enough capacity for the electrics, or there's no gas provision, or the water pressure isn't there because Thames Water can only commit to 1 bar, then you won't be able to produce what you produce. And this might be, in your mind, increasingly insignificant or immaterial, or Lewis, it's far too much detail to be considering on the broad concepts of what we're trying to achieve with great large-scale theses. But I'll just draw you back down to these invisible parts are the important parts where being intuitive and being increasingly more capability towards them, they're just trusted, and that trust and credibility is something we've talked about before. So in this section I'm now going to show you, it's below ground drainage, and it's the connections back through to deal with all series of different parts. Part of it's foul, and then also it's landscape attenuation and rainwater. How are you making sure that your site and the way in which you build, and you build your new building up to the building line, allows you to have inspection chambers, allows you to understand where you need to be merging into the sewer, how you can have a landscape that accommodates your interests and accommodates the plan's requirements? Do you have a landscape scheme like Colville, which deals with public realm, which sets your building into a piece of public realm and brings public realm into the urbanism of that architecture? The Smithson's buildings at the Economist site in St James's is a prime example of that. How does one fit in a piece of new public realm to charge that void? But equally, how does one fit in those buildings and that public realm and that plinth into a position where one can connect into the infrastructure? Are you bringing in infrastructure that means you have to pump all the way back up to the height of the sewer? Or are you building a building that needs tanks on the roof and massive cooling plants and window cleaning BMUs? How and what is your attitude to how that building works? And all of that relates back to the logistics of being able to get the building built. If you're designing a building that means you're building right up to the edge, and therefore, and possibly also requires you to clean the windows with a crane coming off the roof, but the logistics don't allow you to do that because you're adjacent to a railway, then you need to have the foresight to see those two things that are a conflict. Because it is these small, annoyingly material parts that will unpick the viability of what you're trying to achieve. You won't be able to realize the alchemy of what you set out and believed in if somebody just simply says, it's not viable. The market won't buy the opportunity to build your building. You've made it too risky. You haven't priced the risks. And so this connection of logistics and understanding the dirty stuff, the sort of inner parts of the workings of where you make pipes work, little bits and silly parts like that, are bits which you just need to make sure you've covered out, not in huge detail, but in the master plan detail of understanding the plan and section relative to the city, and therefore relative to how the logistics of that site work themselves together. So we're going to pan back through and just sort of build that case again and understand certain parts. So just finding my bearings here. Okay, so in summary, site logistics. Site logistics are critical. Site logistics are critical because they will have an effect on your building height, your building mass, its form, and its language. They will have an effect on what you and how you build that building form and mass, and whether you want the processes of building that building to be visible. Do you want to see a structural steel frame or a cast in situ concrete frame or precast concrete panels? Is the tectonic of those relationships clear and understood by the people who inevitably use the building? When they walk in, do they say, this building's not like that other building, it's far heavier? Are you able to make a heavy building that's honest? Or do you have to make a lightweight building? Or do you want to make a lightweight building, but you have to make a heavy building? What are the parts of this process that demand that of you? And how are you able to stitch in quality into your project to make sure it's realized? Or are you going to have to, or is it incumbent of you that you have to do something quite complicated to realize the opportunity of building on that site? Going back to the City of London example, how easy is it for you to build that tower? Or at a master plan scale, how easy is it for you to take up a huge swathe of the city and expect for a decade construction to take place? If you look at Nine Elms is being built over a period of probably 15 years, from all the way up at New Covent Garden Market in the east of it, all the way down to Battersea in the west of it. And the implications on Wandsworth and Lambeth have been huge. So how does one stitch into that the promises of what will be provided and the logistics in order to achieve that, and the phases with which are needed to run that through? Site logistics is critical. You have to have that intuitive eye of being able to be an entrepreneur that has the alchemy to say, we can do this on this site. I can see it. I can see what's achievable. I can promise you this type of building, with this type of use and this type of return, because I can see what those risks are and I can price them very quickly. I can see the risk of construction in this method in this part of town. That's site logistics.